Welcome to Windows on the World, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information, and no conspiracy theories. On tonight's show. Okay, in the next part of the show, we're talking about Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. Now, we know that Saddam Hussein had many doubles. That's on public record. We know that Osama allegedly had doubles, and we've seen that in some of the pretty obviously faked videos. And of course, there's anomalies as to Osama's death, and probably, when we look into this, to Saddam Hussein's death. So I'm going to bring in Professor Jim Fetzer on this first, and we're going to talk about Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. Over to you, Jim.
Mark, it's such a pleasure to be here and be participating with Nick, who made contributions to each of the four parts of the book, so that, you know, he's a man for all seasons, all issues, extraordinary, and of course the leading expert on the London 7/7 London bombings, subway bombings, with his book Terror on the Tube, now in his third edition, where it was Nick who established that the four young lads who were being accused of the crime couldn't possibly have been at the tube stops, because the train from Luton they would have had to have taken was canceled. So I just want to say how much I admire this man and what a pleasure it is to be on your show with Nick Kollerstrom.
Oh, me too. And myself and Nick and David Shaler did a 7/7 revisited film several years ago on the anniversary of 7/7. And the amazing thing to me about this, as we're coming up to the anniversary of it very soon...
10th anniversary, yeah.
Yes.
10th anniversary.
Is that despite Nick's research, and he was the guy that proved that the train the alleged bombers on could not have got into town at the time stated, because the train was cancelled, despite this evidence and the total loss of rights that have happened since that event and its implications for everyone in this country, nobody in this country seems to have any interest in it at all.
That is fairly dumbfounding, isn't it? Nick, do you have an interpretation?
Well, except our good friend Richard D. Hall, who does Rich Planet research, lives in Wales now. He's always trying to follow some angle on this subject, but otherwise it's just faded out from people's consciousness.
I was really talking about the great British public there, Nick, not researchers.
Yeah,
like
the great British public. Yeah. It's just faded out. There's us lot, there's David Shaler, Richard D. Hall. Otherwise, the great British public, they just want to reach for a beer, switch the telly on, and that's about it.
And that takes us into our next subject. So they can reach for a beer, watch the telly, see videos that aren't Osama bin Laden and videos that aren't Saddam Hussein. So if we start with Saddam Hussein, let's go into the book and what we are going to find out when we buy a copy of the book.
Well, it's a truly extraordinary story, Mark, and I only learned it because of the mother of the B-1 bomber pilot who was actually responsible for his death, having contacted me with the actual story of how it had taken place, and where I told her I was fascinated, but I needed documentation, I needed proof, and she proved to be very, very adept. She actually is a certified court stenographer. She's investigative services certified, and she just produced one proof after another. I was really so terribly impressed with her. And it turns out that her son, whose name is Chris Wachter, was a B-1 bomber pilot in Iraq. He was on a mission when he was intercepted electronically and told he had a new assignment, a new target. It was the big one. They gave him the coordinates. They had him check them over and over again. They told him not to miss. And he dropped 2 JDAM bombs on a restaurant on the outskirts of Baghdad, completely demolishing the building. And when he returned to base, he was met with jubilation. He was lionized. He was put on CNN. He would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross because, as it would turn out, he had taken out Saddam Hussein, his 2 sons, and 50 or 60 members of the general staff. And what is most intriguing about this is that the American military command had been able to track Saddam because he was using custom-made Jaguar cell phones that were produced in the UK, but where the manufacturer had designed them in such a way that they were trackable. So they were able to zero in on his coordinates. All 3 of the Saddam and his 2 sons were there together in the restaurant, and he was taken out. And the son, Chris Wachter, as I say, was celebrated when he came back to California on R&R after his triumphal success. His mission, he was feted in the Crystal Cathedral by the Reverend Robert Schiller, whose programs are not only very famous, but were televised live. And when he was so honored at the Crystal Cathedral, the following day he was contacted by the Pentagon, which directed him to fly back to Langley, where he was debriefed and told that while they admired his flying skills, that officially Saddam had got away. And it turns out that this explains why the whole mission accomplished celebration aboard the USS Lincoln off the coast of San Diego turned out to be such a dud, namely that Bush was originally going to announce that they had taken out Saddam Hussein when someone in the administration, in Yvonne and I believe it was Donald Rumsfeld, realized that 3 presidents, Reagan, Carter, and Ford, had all signed executive orders forbidding the assassination of foreign leaders. So that if Bush had gone aboard the Lincoln and announced what had actually happened, he would have been in violation of those executive orders, which have the status of law, and therefore would have been put in a compromising position. So they had to forego announcing that they'd actually taken out Saddam Hussein. They actually put a double in a spider hole where he was allegedly found, and then put him on trial and actually wound up hanging him, which the whole world believed was the real Saddam. But a very perceptive Australian investigator by the name of Joe Viles noticed there was something wrong here. Not only did Saddam's wife finally have the chance to visit with the person they had captured, coordinated by the Red Cross, but she came out screaming, "This is not my husband. This is one of his doubles. What have you done with my husband?" Which created quite a sensation, but only locally because it wasn't broadcast widely at the time. And Vales compared the bite in the teeth, and it turned out that the double had very bad teeth and had an underbite, whereas lower teeth extended beyond his upper teeth, whereas Saddam Hussein had a magnificent teeth and an overbite, whereas upper teeth extended beyond his lower teeth. And I went about verifying that what he had identified was correct. I got the ace of spades from the military command in Iraq, and he was exactly right about the teeth, the identity, the whole story. And we even have a report, which I publish in the prologue, from the New York Times, where Vice President Dick Cheney is saying, yes, he thinks we got Saddam, that his lifeless body was dragged from the rubble.
It's really fascinating, Jim. And just to remind people, if they've forgotten about this, Saddam Hussein was dragged out of this tiny little hole, and it looked as though he'd been living on packets of biscuits, and they were alleging that he'd been driving around in a taxi all night. The whole story seemed ludicrous to start with. And when he was hung, allegedly, It was cell phone footage, which again was not convincing. So over to you, Nick.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a wonderful story that Jim's unearthed. I mean, we'd all heard the story of the wife of Saddam Hussein saying, "Look, this isn't him," coming out screaming, but we hadn't had the motive explained clearly as Jim has. All I know is that there's always a mystery. If you have a double pretending to be somebody and they're going to get hung in the end, what is their motive for playing along? Is he told that he'll be let off if he does this, and then too late he discovers that he isn't? Or
I suspect that's exactly right, Nick. That he was promised that if he played his role, that he would survive. They'd have a table or a stand so that when he was hung, it wouldn't actually kill him. But then they conveniently omitted to place it there because you couldn't have this guy walking around, right? It would have been too obvious, too much of a risk, even if it was in Tahiti sipping Mai Tais, to have this guy who was a veritable embodiment of the man who had been tried and hung as Saddam Hussein. That just wouldn't do. So I think they shorted him on the rope, shall we say.
Yeah. Well, let's hope this chapter of yours, Jim, helps to bring out the arch criminal nature of the attack on Iraq and the arch criminal conspirators who designed this war.
Well, absolutely. That's a really good point, Nick. And I think this really ties in with everything we're talking about here, that our history is manufactured now by our media, and we can't trust any of it. Because when I saw the footage, it was very much like the Osama bin Laden footage in the respect that, yes, there seems to be doubles used. So I think maybe we should go into that. How many doubles did Saddam Hussein have?
He had several. He had several doubles. And in fact, Yvonne has identified which double it was, which you'll find in the article here, where there are two about Saddam that report as to the facts of the matter. And what I find so striking about this, and why the Paul McCartney story is such an appropriate framework, is that if you could replace Paul McCartney, the most conspicuous man in the world, you could replace anyone. So that, replacing Saddam was a relative piece of cake, not to mention what would happen in the case of Osama bin Laden, which was an even more clumsy form of deception, but which we can approach as soon as you're ready.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's a very good point with the way the media works. It's incredibly easy to replace a public figure. And this is, I think, the key point, that all you need is a double who can sound a little bit like the original. Because all this we ever get from our controlled media is sound bites. So all you need is a double who can speak some sound bites to the public on mainstream media news. That's all you need.
Yeah. Could we perhaps come on to bin Laden now?
All right then, Nick.
Is that right? Well, I think it's absolutely staggering that something resembling 36 fake tapes were produced over a period of about 10 years after bin Laden's death, a few months after the 9/11 events. I mean, it's just staggering proof of the way that the media are prepared to go along with manifest hoaxes. I mean, this character is a very vivid character, and there's a great danger that his real personality will fade away, because that is always the nature with state-fabricated terror, that they erase the real identity of the person and put their own made-up diabolical image. But I think bin Laden was a very fascinating, enigmatic character. Maybe he was always on the CIA payroll. Certainly he was employed as an architect to design the whole lot of caverns in the Tora Bora Mountains when the war with Russia, Afghanistan was going on. He was employed by the CIA for that. He used to walk around America called Tim Osman. Tim Osman, that was his name. Over 6 foot high, but very characteristic fellow. And then he did set up some alliance for resisting the Crusader in the Holy Land. in I think 98. He set up that such an alliance, and that did involve killing American soldiers in the Holy Land, but just in what for them Saudi Arabia, the Holy Land, and so it was a resistance, and that is what the media made out to be Al Qaeda. Okay, so he was a real character. June 2011, we find him in Dubai in a hospital, and his various Bin Laden relatives come to visit him, and he's suffering from kidney failure.
2001, Nick. 2001.
2001. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. Yeah.
It was 2 days, allegedly 2 days before 9/11, I think.
Well, hang on. Just let me get to that.
Yeah.
And a French journalist comes and reports it. This is all reported in a French newspaper. Then 2 days before 9/11, he's in a hospital in Rawalpindi in Pakistan. Again, he's on kidney dialysis. He's very severely ill, hasn't got long to live. And I think this is terribly clever of the people who designed the 9/11 event. They had to have Bin Laden living long enough to take the blame, but not long enough and not well enough to be able to say, hey, look, this isn't me at all. These are fake messages. It's not really me. Bin Laden put out something like 3 main statements after 9/11 saying that he'd got nothing to do with the event, published in, I think, Pakistan and Afghanistan newspapers, and disclaiming any responsibility. And then there was one posthumous. He died 14th of December, and there was one posthumous statement he came out with, I think 24th of that year, about the struggle which had to go on after his death. And that is the last Bin Laden statement, okay? You get, in the last days, there was about 3 different intelligence agencies monitoring every telephone call he made from the Tora Bora Mountains. For example, he rang up his mother, and so they know perfectly well and those phone calls suddenly stop around the 14th of December, okay? That is when he passes away. And then I think a year later his will surfaces. There's a will, and he's buried. The site of his burial is not known, but there was a funeral, and there was a will. So there's no doubt whatever that he died and was buried, and it's not really a mystery. The mystery is how come the American and British people are dumb enough to believe these obviously fake videos produced by bored-looking actors, and also there's a secondary question: why is Pakistan stupid enough to agree to produce these videos, which sort of in Pakistani mountains, claiming that he's hanging out in the Pakistani mountains? Why does the ISI, that's the Pakistani intelligence services, why do they agree to produce these Bin Laden videos, which get Pakistan into so much trouble? I mean, Americans totally believe their own propaganda, and those videos that Pakistan kept producing, because it was told to, of bored-looking actors claiming to be Bin Laden, threatening this, that, and the other, that leads Americans to believe that terrorism is flourishing in Pakistan, and now they've loads of drone planes flying over, allegedly fighting terror in Pakistan. That is, I would suggest, a kind of consequence of Pakistan having foolishly agreed to make so many of these fake Bin Laden videos. And then there's an absurd bit of theatre with Obama supposedly bumping off Bin Laden in some roof of a house.
I think Hillary Clinton's there as well. And this is the amazing thing, isn't it, about the media? They publish a still photograph of a room full of people from the White House, all looking to their left. And we're meant to believe that they're looking at Osama bin Laden being killed, but we're not allowed to see the footage, and we're not allowed to see them seeing the footage.
Yeah, right.
And Leon, it was widely distributed as them watching the raid in real time. But
That's
Leon
right.
Panetta, then the director of Central Intelligence, revealed that there had been no live coverage for the first 20 or 25 minutes, which was the total lapse time of the raid, which meant that it was simply a staged photograph for the sake of political spin. And as Nick is implying, I mean, Osama, actually, he was our man in Afghanistan. He was instrumental in getting the Sidewinder missiles to the resistance movement that drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
He died of his medical ailments. It's tough to get those dialysis machines in and out of those caves in Afghanistan. He was buried in an unmarked grave. There were local obituaries. Even, and this is quite fascinating, Fox News issued a report, Osama bin Laden already dead on 26 December 2001. Nick, that report is still online, still online.
Right,
And David Ray Griffin would publish a book about it, Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive. Nick would publish his article, Osama bin Laden, 1957 to 2001. And when they resurrected him for political purposes to kill him, for him to die a second time in Pakistan, I published an expose entitled Zero Dark 30, The Deeper, Darker Truths, and revealed not only had he died in December of 2001, but as a founder of Scholars, I'd published a press release in 2006 involving consultation with a leading expert on Osama in the world, Professor Bruce Lawrence from Duke, who explained how the audios and the videos we were being given were not authentic from Osama bin Laden. And of course, if he'd continued to live during that period of time, they could have had at least authentic Osama audios and videos. But since he was long since deceased, and then they went through the motions of the raid, buried him at sea, claiming it was in accordance with Muslim tradition, when of course it was nothing of the kind. They photoshopped death scenes of his face, but they're clearly fake. And, claimed they had DNA comparisons in a time that was much too brief to have been scientifically possible. So we were subjected to a mass of propaganda. But Mark, the effect it had is this. In 2011, Barack Obama was under criticism because Guantanamo had not been closed. So they claimed that the tip about Osama's location had come from Guantanamo. Oh, aren't we glad it's open after all? He'd been criticized for having troops stationed in Pakistan. So they used troops stationed in Pakistan. Oh, aren't we glad those troops are there after all? And it took the issue of his birth certificate, clearly fraudulent, off of the front page and positioned him for a triumphal re-election as the man who got the most wanted man in the world. It was a brilliant political stroke, but it was all political theater.
Oh, but how come Americans are so gullible? I don't get it. What
Americans are crap.
Hey Nick,
utter crap.
We are the most gullible population in the world, Nick. We are the most gullible.
Well, I don't know about that, Jim, because if you look at the images that are put on the front of the Sun newspaper regularly, then I think we're really on a par, because when we're talking about these so-called terror attacks, I mean, the tabloids in this country do exactly the same thing. We were never shown anything. So we're meant to believe that they're watching it in real time, which they weren't, and that they were all actually there for that reason, which they probably weren't. So what? And
was there also a story? Sorry to interrupt. That the Navy SEALs who'd done this bit of theatre were then themselves bumped off in some accident. That they all died.
Yes, a helicopter crash.
So they couldn't tell any story.
They overloaded an old helicopter, and it was an old helicopter that they overloaded to take out a large percentage of the SEALs. It's a very disturbing sequel to the whole event.
Well, it is, because those people may well have been killed in reality. But,
they appear to be honest, bona fide deaths, yes.
Yeah, well, they never care about those people. But there is an amusing twist to this story, because you can still see these videos on YouTube when a reporter goes into Pakistan and asks the people there if they thought Osama bin Laden lived amongst them in this small village. And they were all laughing and said, of course not. And they said, well, who's this guy who we've got watching this old television? Of course, we've seen the narration.
Holding a clicker.
This is Osama bin Laden, a shell of his former self, watching a tiny colour TV of some of his videos.
An image the White House wants the world to see. Apparently a dishevelled and much diminished Osama bin Laden watching himself on TV. The footage was edited by the Pentagon and released without sound. It's said to be one of 5 videos found in bin Laden's compound. The image was front page news in Pakistan today, but in Abbottabad, where he met his end, there was plenty of scepticism. It's all a fake. Nothing happened, said Mohammed, who's been selling newspapers here for 50 years. Shabir says it's a case of mistaken identity. He claims the man in the picture is his neighbour.
His name is Akbar Khan. He owns the house they said was Osama's house. I know him very well.
If the aim was to persuade the doubters, it didn't work here.
This picture is not Osama.
It's very suspicious.
This picture.
It is very suspicious, and it is made by advanced technology.
Made by computer.
By computer, yeah, ma'am.
We've now spoken to more than 50 people in the market, and only one believes that the man in the video watching television was in fact Osama bin Laden. People here say the Americans haven't proven anything. They haven't shown bin Laden's dead body. Many still don't believe that the Al-Qaeda leader was living here or that he was killed here. It's unclear when and where the videos were made. Tonight, President Obama said bin Laden must have had some sort of support network in Pakistan, perhaps involving people in government, which must be investigated.
Well, is there have we got any chance for a real biography of Osama bin Laden being published, or is that totally out of the question? I mean, he's a great character, world famous, everybody in the world's heard of him. I mean, we do need a real biography, surely.
A real book about it?
Yeah, but
Well, we need
who's going to
someone-
write
yeah,
that, Nick?
story.
I mean, David Ray Griffin, has 10 books on 9/11. One of them is the one I mentioned, Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive. So
Yeah, okay, I suppose that is. Yeah, okay, that's...
It's not really a biography, though, is it?
it's not what?
It's not really a biography.
Well, sure. I mean, there's room for more. I'd have to look at what Bruce Lawrence has done about Osama. I think there are works on him, Nick, that you and I simply haven't been, had the chance to read yet. But I suspect there's
someone
quite
should
a bit
make a film about his life. He's such a, exciting character.
Well,
I'm curious,
there's a political issue in relation to Hollywood, Nick, because Hollywood is not disposed to present the truth about quite a range of issues that are politically
Especially
significant.
him. Especially him. Yeah. Osama bin Laden, action hero, Hollywood movie, don't think so.
I mean, you will get films about our next subject, such as Schindler's List or The Reader or Sophie's Choice or, a whole host of other movies about the Holocaust. But unfortunately, it turns out they bear scant relationship to the reality of what was actually going on, Mark. This has really been a fascinating venture where Nick turns out to be one of the leading experts on the Holocaust in the world today.
Exactly, which is taking us into our next segment. But before we do that, so Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. Jim, do you think that both of those guys are dead?
They both died and they were both replaced in different ways, albeit, but that's the way it played out.
Yes, I'm in agreement with that. What about you, Nick?
Well, bin Laden died in 2001, and I don't doubt that what Jim has said about Saddam Hussein is also the case. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on now to the last section of the show. What is known as the Holocaust? And this is something that Nick knows a lot about because his career was curtailed for questioning it, wasn't it, Nick?
Yeah, my mum was a chemist. So I was fascinated by the measurement of cyanide in the walls of Auschwitz as telling you where the cyanide was used 60 years ago. I thought it was a fascinating subject. And I published a couple of articles online, and this turned out to be a reason for me being thrown out of my college, science department, being ethically damned in the media. And everyone said this is terrifically important. It means that you're a Nazi and stuff. And it was so important that a lot of people couldn't bear to speak to me anymore. And I wondered, well, what is so tremendously, overwhelmingly important about this? Why does it seem to be more important than anything else in the world? And why are we not allowed to talk about it? Why are we all reduced to silence? And that got me going on the subject. And I met a few other revisionists. That seems to be a word for people who want to reanalyze what happened in World War II. But maybe it wasn't a war of good versus evil. And we got talking. So eventually I produced this, Breaking the Spell book.
By way of a preface, Mark, let me just note that in my chapter on the Holocaust narrative, I begin with a quote The fastest way to get expelled from a British university is by saying you are looking at chemical evidence for how Zyklon was used in World War II, with a discussion of how delousing technology functioned in the German World War II labor camps. Nicholas Kollerstrom.
That's absolutely
Yeah,
true,
I
Jim.
think
And
what-
just before
yeah.
you come in, Nick, I just wanted to read something from your book because I think it'll lead us into this. And for people who haven't read the book, I think they'll find it very interesting. So you've got 7 points here about what a Holocaust denier is. And I'm just going to read them out because I think it's a very good way of getting into this subject. Number 1, the only thing at Auschwitz resembling a human gas chamber was constructed in 1946 by Stalin. A Holocaust denier is someone who recognises this fact. 2, not a single diagnosis of death by cyanide poisoning is on record for any German labour camp. A Holocaust denier is someone who recognises this fact. 3, no trace whatever remains of the millions of bodies allegedly gassed in the German labour camps. A Holocaust denier is someone who recognises this fact. 4, none of the war generals after the war who wrote their memoirs made any allusion to human gas chambers or indeed to any intention to exterminate an ethnic group. A Holocaust denier is someone who recognises this fact. 5, the Red Cross made normal routine visits to Auschwitz during the war, and its published reports made no allusion to any ongoing human gassing there. A Holocaust denier recognises this. Number 6, no authentic documents attesting to the Holocaust exist anywhere. Only wicked Holocaust deniers recognise this fact. 7, the Bad Arolsen archives list everyone who lived and died in all the German labour camps. The question naturally arises as to what is the total number recorded in this tremendous archive. Clearly, the managers of this archive are not at liberty to tell of this, or they would be jailed for so awful a crime. A Holocaust deniers are aware of this. Now, I think that's very important because, as you quite rightly state, if you state that Zyklon B was used for killing lice and for delousing clothes in delousing chambers, you're a Holocaust denier.
Yeah, exactly. That's the essence of it. Yeah.
But yet it's a manifest fact. They use a vast quantity of Zyklon B for precisely that purpose because the disease, dysentery, typhus, and the like needed to be controlled. They had to eradicate the body lice, and they used Zyklon B for that purpose. And it turns out, Mark, and this is why I regard Nick's book as so superlative, building on the work of others, such as Rudolf Germar, he observed that if you use Zyklon B in a chamber, that the interaction with the elements in the walls will turn the walls blue. And the only walls that turn blue in these camps are those that were used for delousing. And that, in addition, bodies of persons who die from cyanide poisoning turn pink, but we have no report of pink bodies from any of the camps.
Exactly.
Which means that those two basic elements of the Holocaust narrative are not merely false, but have been scientifically refuted.
Yes, Jim, you were referring to Germar Rudolph there, who was a chemist who Nick's met and actually interviewed. And Germar Rudolph was put in prison just for testing the walls at Auschwitz. So tell us a bit more about that, Nick.
Well, he and Leuchter, Fred Leuchter, the two people who did those very thorough surveys, and that got the whole revisionist movement going because the results were so clear and simple. It showed that the Zyklon, many tons of Zyklon were used in German labour camps from 1942 onwards, were used for killing bugs and not human beings. You know, Jews were absolutely not put into large gas chambers. That cannot at any level be shown at all. It's just storyland. And we have a culture in which stories are encouraged. Germany pays money to anyone claiming to be a Holocaust survivor. They've coughed up 100 billion Deutschmarks at least to anyone who claims to be a survivor. And the total number of claims now is about 6 million. You've got about 6 million people holding out their hand for compensation from Germany on the grounds of being a Holocaust survivor since the war ended. And they've given money to about 4 million, okay? So you have got the figure of 6 million Jews. That is a real figure, and it's a number of people who have claimed to be survivors of the Holocaust. The total number of Jews ever occupied, and all the lands occupied by Nazi Germany, is between 3 and 4 million, okay? Those are the estimates, wartime estimates of how many there were. So you got kind of mad, impossible arithmetic that is obviously fantastic. It can't bear any relation to what happened. The 6 million is a mantra. It's a repetitive mantra that starts at the end of the 19th century and it keeps iterating right through the 20th century in newspaper headlines. 6 million Jews threatened, 6 million Jews in danger. And it starts off in America as a fundraising ploy for Jews. It started off, Jews in Russia, 6 million Jews in Russia are in danger, and we need to rescue them and help them and so on. And then it became 6 million Jews in Europe, and finally it's 6 million Jews threatened by Hitler. You've got something around about 200 newspaper headlines. And when it becomes canonical at Nuremberg, there's no hint that anybody counted that number at all. It's just the canonical number, and it becomes accepted at Nuremberg. And now that is an essential part of what every good citizen is required to believe. Okay? If you doubt that 6 million figure, then you are a wicked Holocaust denier.
Mark, these allusions to 6 million, which began appearing in the newspapers as early as 1890. There are 236 references to 6 million Jews who are either in jeopardy or fear of the loss of their lives before the Nuremberg tribunals. Now, as Nick is implying, it has no empirical or historical basis. In fact, the International Committee of the Red Cross kept very meticulous records on all the deaths in all of the camps. They kept their age, race, ethnicity, and all that. As Nick observes in passing, more Catholics died at Auschwitz than Jews, which is remarkable in and of itself. But
as recorded in the death books of Auschwitz. As recorded in the death books, yeah.
In their updating of the figures in 1993, they arrived at the conclusion that some 293 and 87 had died altogether, if I recollect the number accurately, Nick. Which is, of course,
none from gassing, none
from Zyklon B. And it appears to have its origin in a disputed passage in Leviticus, Mark, that has been interpreted as meaning that the chosen people can return to the promised land only when they're minus 6 million, which requires a contortion because the number wasn't inherent in the original language, who have been consumed in the flame. So it appears as though the 6 million, having no historical or empirical basis, is a matter of faith or theology, and that's its derivative from this disputed passage in Leviticus.
Yes, because there weren't quite enough of them at the time to actually gain this homeland, according to that biblical passage. I think a very good thing to bring in is the Ernst Zundel trial, Nick.
I must say, the only way for about the last 40 or 50 years that revisionists to be able to get public discussion on the subject is by being prosecuted. And in a court trial, you can briefly have a debate on the subject before you're found guilty. Okay, and that's what happened with the Zundel trials. Ernst Zundel, he had a brilliant advisor, Robert Forison, the great dean of modern revisionism, and he had a wonderful lawyer, Doug Christie, and he kept winning the arguments. And the opposition was required to summon anyone they could find who claimed to be a witness to the gas chambers, right? So could the prosecution find anyone in Europe who had witnessed in any way the human gas chambers? And on oath, right? There are tons and tons of books written about this subject, obviously a huge literature, but would anyone come forward on oath and say this? And it turned out, no, there was absolutely nothing resembling credible testimony that the prosecution could produce by way of anyone on oath who would give evidence for human gassing or anything like that. And we didn't know that until the Zundel trial. Okay, that's what the Zundel trial really ascertained. And the other amazing thing Zundel did was find Fred Leuchter, tell him what he had to do, send him off to Poland, and he chipped away and took the samples and measured them, took the measurements, and the measurements, all his data was read out at the trial, showing the very high levels of cyanide in the delousing chambers and the complete absence of any elevation of cyanide whatsoever in what alleged to be human gas chambers. That was a tremendous bit of evidence that we thank Ernst Zundel for in that trial.
Absolutely, and I'm going to get onto that in a minute. But for people who don't know who Fred Leuchter was, Fred Leuchter was brought in as an expert witness because he had first-hand knowledge of the building of gas chambers in America. And he was very, very important. Can you just, for people out there who may not have come across Fred Leuchter, his videos are still on YouTube and you can find them there.
Yeah.
But Nick, just tell us who Fred Leuchter is.
Well, they call him Dr. Death. As you said, he wanted to make death by cyanide, by gas in America, kind of quick and efficient. And so he was the expert on the subject. There's no denying that. And his colleagues testified that he was the expert on the subject. And obviously his entire career was terminated. Once he gave witness at the Zonal trial, he could not ever get employment again and, internationally vilified and everything. But the fact is his report was translated into different languages, went all around the world, and nobody can refute it in any way. And then it was totally endorsed by the later work of the brilliant German chemist, German Rudolph, who did much the same thing, more thoroughly. You see, Leuchter wasn't primarily interested in chemistry, right? He was primarily interested in the design of the chambers that he looked at. He was the first person to really go to these behind the Iron Curtain. It's forbidden to go. He crept in and looked at the design of these chambers, and he said there is absolutely nothing in any German Labour camp that could possibly be a human gas chamber. However wicked you were, how much you wanted to gas Jews, there's no possibility that anything in these buildings could be used for mass human gassing, and just from the design and the structure, you have to have properly sealed doors. They didn't have any, various things. There clearly weren't any. It was just a sort of fairy tale, this story. And he was the first person to bring a sense of physical reality into what buildings were actually where. Here and where the furnaces were, because bodies did have to be incinerated, okay? And because the ground was too damp to bury anyone. So you had, once the typhoid epidemic broke out in 1942, you did have to burn an awful lot of bodies, and you did have to have morgue chambers next to those furnaces where you piled up the stiffs waiting to be burned. That kind of thing. That's like the
This
basic
is what
design.
a lot of these eyewitness accounts are actually about. They all get petrified about this smell of burning flesh. But I just want to, before we move on to Jim,
Mark. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah,
I'd just like to bring up this from your book where you put these quotes in, which are very important. Zundel's lawyer, Doug Christie, put these questions to a top Holocaust expert, Dr. Raoul Hilberg, the author of the definitive multi-volume, multi-edition work, The Destruction of the European Jews. So, Christie, can you give me one scientific report that shows the existence of gas chambers anywhere in Nazi-occupied territory? Hilberg states, I'm at a loss. Christie, you are at a loss because you can't. I want one report before, during or after the war that shows that someone was killed by the use of those gases. Hilberg, you want an autopsy report, and I know of no autopsy. He could not cite one scientific report, and I think that's incredibly important.
Oh, I think it is too. I think you're absolutely right. My attitude has always been if the Holocaust was real, then research would sustain it. And if it was not, the world deserves to know. But of course, anyone who pursues even scientific research of the kind and caliber that Nick and Rudolph have pursued is subject to being identified as being an anti-Semite or indulging in hate speech. But the fact of the matter is anti-Semites are those who disvalue or discount the value or worth of persons or their opinions on the basis of their religious orientation or their ethnic origins. None of us who have contributed to this book do that, which means that we are not anti-Semites. And the further claim is often made, Mark, that we're indulging in hate speech, which could be defined as any speech, gesture, or conduct, writing, or display, which is forbidden because it may incite violence or prejudicial action against or by a protected individual or group, or because it disparages or intimidates a protected individual or group. But we don't do that either, unless accurately reporting the results of scientific research on a major historical event qualifies as hate speech. So it would appear we face the choice of either not reporting the results of scientific research on a major historical event or risking being accused of hate speech. In sorting out some of the most complex and controversial issues of our time, therefore, we take the stand that truth is preferable to mythology.
Yes, that's a very good point, Jim, because what's thrown at people who question this or indeed research it is off topic. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. What we're doing is looking at an event and analysing that event. And that has nothing to do with a race of people or a religion. And some people say the Jews are a race, some people say it's a religion, and some people say it's neither. So all that is totally irrelevant to what we're talking about. But if I'd had a terrible injustice done to me and a scientist wanted to come along and analyse the evidence for me, I'd welcome them with open arms.
Yes, Mark. And you know, it was another Brit. It was when Gilad Otzman came to Madison and gave a talk about Jewish identity politics that it struck me how the official narrative of the Holocaust has been used to advance the Zionist agenda as a political lever to manipulate Western nations into subservience to Israel on the basis of their sense of guilt for allowing 6 million Jews to be exterminated during World War II.
These are the people who are funding this, and that's incredibly important.
Yeah, especially in Britain. We get massive funding for all sorts of Holocaust education trusts and everything. It just never stops. And schools have compulsory visits to Auschwitz, and it's in the newspaper every week. And it's as if, people have to hate the Nazis as if the war just ended yesterday, not 70 years ago. It is kept in our consciousness. And there's not a penny available for anyone who wants to do any independent research. All the money is to shore up a fixed story, which you're not allowed to doubt. It's the only thing taught in our school. It's the most heavily taught thing in the modern educational syllabus, and it's the only thing you're not allowed to doubt. It's taught in modern schools that here is the narrative, you accept it, you don't question it, and only a few very wicked people, deniers, want to doubt it or question it.
And Mark, one
Jim.
of the reasons I included a map of Auschwitz, it's on page 289 of our book, is because the camp included so many features that would not be present were this actually a center for extermination rather than a labor camp, including a hospital with surgical unit, obstetrical, gynecological block for inmates, quarantine areas for newly arriving patients. There was workshops for woodworking and sewing. There were orchestra played Sunday concerts there. There was a kitchen with 13 coal-fired stoves. There was even, Mark, believe it or not, a brothel, an art museum, and a library.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll be Bill O'Reilly here for a minute. Okay, Mr. Fetzer, and you're going to say there was a cinema there for Saturday nights and a swimming pool, right? Go on, Nick.
Well, sometimes they had their own money. They could buy stuff like cigarettes. That was part of the scheme. But it seems to have been quite a multicultural experience of different groups sort of swirling around and meeting and having discussion groups. And I think they did the best they can. I mean, it was basically a hard-working labour camp, and there were massive arms industries going on around. There were large blast furnaces, there was huge chemical works, and there was recycling industries. Like people think, oh, the hair, oh, how terrible. Oh, God, look, there's hair. That's what you see in Holocaust museums, hair and shoes. Well, they did have recycling, just about anything they could there, part of the wartime industries that they had going. And inmates at the camps, especially Auschwitz was by far the biggest camp, had to trudge out every morning to these local arms munitions factories and to get the best quality work they could out of them. They had, as Jim just put forward, amenities and stuff to do at the weekend,
Well, absolutely, but you just missed what I said there, Nick, about the swimming pool, because the swimming pool was very important in your career, wasn't it? Because one of the things you got attacked over was saying that there was a swimming pool at Auschwitz.
Oh, God,
there was a swimming pool at Auschwitz.
It just never ended.
Right?
Nobody wanted to talk about the chemical studies I looked at. That absolutely wasn't of any interest to anyone. But I had made the comment about an elegant swimming pool, which, by the way, you can see on Google Earth. If you go to Google Earth, go to Auschwitz, you can see the rectangle of the swimming pool, and it has been restored to its former glory. And it was made, I think, by the inmates in '44, and people just go on about, oh, you know what? He says there's a swimming pool at Auschwitz, and it was just too much for them to cope with, you know.
Mark, the reality was so different than the impressions that are conveyed that I put on the back cover of the book a photograph of the British football team at Auschwitz with a caption, "What? You didn't know there was a UK soccer team at Auschwitz?"
Well, exactly. And then we go into the Holocaust survivors, of which there appears to be more and more all the time, doesn't there, Nick?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, it never stops. Yeah, Holocaust survivors. As I say, they've got at the turn of this century. There's 1 million registered Holocaust survivors alive. So do the maths. How many do you think there would have been after the war? If Germany's whole is offering money to anyone who claims to be that, and the sheer number of people who have held out their hand for that money has utterly negated and refuted their own story. That is the ironic twist.
Well, exactly. Yes. If you're a Holocaust survivor, it's a bit of an oxymoron, but there are some anomalies with these very famous Holocaust survivors. Eli Wiesel, for example. Could you?
Yeah. Well, Eli Wiesel is like the Messiah of the Holocaust, you know, and he turns up in a chauffeured limousine and charges 20 grand for a lecture, you know, and there's this thing about the tattoo. He's supposed to be a survivor at Auschwitz, but there's no tattoo on his arm, right? He has not got that tattoo that he claims to have. He claims that you have to have a number tattooed on your arm, you know, to have really been there. And it's clearly not there. He can't show it to anybody, but he can. He's some sort of, as you say, a great VIP. For example, he went to Hungary. He said, "Look, it's disgraceful. You haven't yet got a law banning Holocaust denial. You ought to do it." And they did it. When a year or two later, Hungary now criminalised Holocaust denial, and Eli Wiesel is pally with Obama, and he rebuked Obama for not yet having started to bomb Iran. You know, he can even tell the president who to bomb. And his book Night has sold 12 million copies, right? And it's interesting. It was written in the 50s, and it doesn't have any gas chambers in. Okay, because in that early time, the gas chambers hadn't really come into public consciousness. Okay, they had the huge funeral pyres, right? The original mythos of the Holocaust. It means literally burning sacrifice, right? Yes. That's what the word means. So to get that terrific word, they had to have burning bodies. And you'll see that in the Schindler's List film, right? The big piles of burning bodies. And so his book graphically describes these huge piles of burning bodies. And get this, lorries would arrive with little kids, and they would unload the little kids into the huge funeral pyres, burning pyres. And Eli Wiesel keeps being with a group marching towards this huge burning pyres. Then mysteriously he escapes. He's not included, and the others all march to their doom. So it's pure hallucinatory phantasm, okay, but with no contact with the real world at all. But this book Night has been used in all sorts of American universities as a textbook. So we're in a condition where people can't tell the difference between hallucinatory nightmare fantasy and the real world.
But there's another thing about Eli Wiesel, in that he appears to have taken his identity from someone called Lazar Wiesel.
Yeah. There's somebody who researched that very carefully, and the number he claims to have does belong to that different person. Yeah. So he is a total fraud and fake. Yeah. He's the world's greatest liar, actually. Greatest living liar.
And he's being heavily promoted. But on a lighter note with all this, obviously people are going to forge careers in this. It's going to be very lucrative for them. But my favourite is Irene Lisblatt, who reckons that Mengele removed the tattoo from her arm because she had such good skin, he wanted to make her into a lampshade.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, I
She's
think
my personal favourite.
Catholics should get in this lucrative business. I mean, it's clear that, well, according to death books, more Catholics died than Jews at Auschwitz. I think, you know, they should start writing books about I survived at Auschwitz, but it was hell. And you know, why not?
Well, exactly. So, Jim, originally, I believe that before you really researched this and got into it, you believed this to be a real historical event, as did we all, because we were told it
We
was.
did all that. Yeah, we did, yeah.
So when did you get into this subject and start looking at it? Was it about the time that you met Nick?
No, no, no. It was actually independent. It was in relation to a conference on academic freedom. Are there limits to inquiry? Held on the campus of the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, where we were using JFK 9/11 and the Holocaust as illustrations because it, had been of concern to me and other participants that there were more or less unspoken boundaries within academia that would restrain doing research on these subjects. I was an exception because I actually did a great deal of research, chaired 5 different conferences while I was still a professor on the Duluth campus of the University of Minnesota, published 3 collections of expert studies on the death of JFK. But it just so happened that there was an associate dean in the graduate school on the Twin Cities campus who really admired my work. And I think that gave me a certain degree of political cover. I founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth in December of 2005. I would retire after a 35-year career, principally offering courses in logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning just 6 months later. And I do not know whether the university would have been as welcoming and supportive and appreciative of my research on 9/11 as it was of my research on JFK. But it was really, while I had a casual interest in the Holocaust, just because it seemed like such an interesting subject, it was only when I became serious tracking down about the origins of the number 6 million, for example, and participating in that conference where Nick joined in, by the way, by Skype from the UK. So you can find that conference online under, American Freedom, Academic Freedom Conference, Are There Limits to Inquiry, which Stephen Francis originally conceived and sponsored.
Yes. It's very fascinating, everything we've talked about tonight, but this is the most controversial subject of all with many people, because we're all taught that it's a real event and it happened, but the consequences of that playing out of this historical event has affected millions and millions of people. And
Yes.
It's a political ideology which set up Israel, and in this last election, we now know that Israel runs Britain, because David Cameron got in when we know that the loads and loads of postal votes went missing, and nobody was expecting the Conservatives to get in. But the biggest funders of the Conservative Party are people who are putting money in through the Friends of Israel. So this is very serious for all of us, because if we set up Israel, when we're now seeing the consequences of that foreign power running our government. What do you think about that, Jim?
Well, I think it's a very significant issue, and it appears the techniques the CIA has used abroad to steal elections are being used in the UK and right here in the USA, may I say, especially since 2000. We've had one election that was controlled by the abuse of electronic voting machines after another, where the owners have close ties to the Republican Party. In the case of Ohio in 2004, the owner of the voting company even said he'd do his best to make sure Bush Cheney were reelected, and by God, he did that. Well, a point I want to make, by the way, since we're coming to the conclusion of our conversation, is that the arguments that are made in this book about all of the issues we've been discussing here are objective, empirical, scientific arguments. None of them is merely a matter of subjective opinion or personal belief. They are all thoroughly documented, and therefore, if anyone wants to contest what we're presenting here, they need to come to grips with the evidence. They have to show what's wrong with the evidence or what's wrong with the reasoning. And I can assure you that after 35 years of offering courses in precisely that subject, there's nothing wrong with the evidence or the reasoning in this book. But if someone wants to make a game of it, if they want to make a play, if they want to seek to defeat us, they're going to need logic and evidence on their side to do it.
I think that's a really good point, Jim, because of all the people I have ever interviewed, you and Nick are the most meticulous in your research. on anything that you talk about.
Goodness, right. Oh, right. Amazing. Right. Cool. Well,
But it
one
has a
question,
lot.
Mark.
It has a lot to do, Mark, with the fact that we share a common background. Nick is an historian of science by training, and I earned my PhD in the history and the philosophy of science. So we both understand the primacy of the laws of science and serious reasoning on any subject. I think that has made a major difference in the quality of our contributions to these controversial and complex subjects.
Yeah, and also, as you said, Jim, as a science historian, I like getting to real primary source documents, and that was a big thrill, Mark, to go to the National Archives in Kew and get these wartime documents that had only just been released, decrypting the German, the German radio messages during the war at Bletchley Park, and directly overhearing the German labour camps. And no historian wants to hear about these decrypts because they don't show any sign of the Holocaust going on. But over from January 42 to January 43, there were these, week by week, detailed messages about all the different things going on in the labour camps, plus arithmetic totals, the total number of people coming and going from the camps, divided into different groups: Poles, Russians, Jews, Germans, and that really was why I decided to write the book, because clearly there's no trace of any Holocaust going on in these messages. It's just trying to get the best they can of constructive labour out of these diverse groups of people, and that is real primary historical, documentation. You can't get more authentic or more immediate than that. I would say, and so it is a kind of thrill for me to get those primary source documents, and I hope the people of England will come to understand that what they show is totally authentic.
Yes, that's a really good point, Nick, because I've read Breaking the Spell, and of course you contributed to the book that we're talking about tonight, which is And I Suppose We Didn't Go to the Moon Either. So I think that's a great introduction, that book, to people on these subjects, which they should research for themselves. And that's the point. With all of this stuff, the information is there. The Arelson documents are there. The documents you looked at in Kew are there. These documents are there. And when we talk about this subject, we have to remember that towards the end of the war, Germany had been completely decimated. And of course, people were dying all over the place. Those emaciated bodies and people dying in the camps were happening. But it was a result of what the Allied bombing had done to Germany. And people have to remember that, I think.
Yeah, 2 million tons of bombs dropped on Central Europe, that caused the horror and devastation that the Allies then turned into sordid wartime propaganda.
The Allied bombing not only destroyed the German cities, which is a collective punishment that the Geneva Conventions qualify today as a war crime, but they interdicted the railroad lines and made it impossible to resupply the camps. That wasn't the policy of the Third Reich. You can't get work out of a corpse, but they were unable to do anything more about it at that point in time, given what the Allies had done to Germany.
Yes, I think that's a very sobering place to leave it for people to think about, because that's a subject that's never brought up. And I think it's a very important one, because we're here to kind of redress the balance a little bit. And
right.
Just before we go, Jim, we know that you've split from what was Veterans Today, and you've set up Veterans News Network. So give us a bit of information about where we can find your stuff.
Yes. Thank you, Mark. You can find my stuff at Veterans Truth Network. You can find myself at jamesfetzer.blogspot.com. You can find myself especially at MBC, which stands for Media Broadcasting Center, The Real Deal, where I have now nearly 60 video versions of my formerly 2-hour radio show. Now it's a 2-hour video show, which gives me the opportunity to present much more in the way of evidence, so much of which is visual, and where I have spent quite a few of my recent shows on Jade Helm, which I regard as the greatest threat to democracy and freedom in the United States in our history.
And Nick, where can we find your work?
Well, this Holocaust stuff is whatreallyhappened.info. That's the site a group of revisionists have put up for the put up for that. Yeah.
Well, thanks for being on the show, and I suppose we didn't go to the moon either.
Great pleasure,
It's been a pleasure,
Mark.
Mark.
Thanks for joining us on Windows on the World. Remember, keep watching those, watching us, watching Windows on the World. We'll see you soon.